Well, folks, we've reached the last chapter in the Phyllis Day textbook, and this is a short chapter where she sort of pulls together her philosophies about all the things that she has been writing about throughout the history of social welfare in the United States and even before the United States was formed. And this is sort of her swan song for you, I suppose, if you will. And it's worth kind of taking a look at this, just sort of these few pages and what they mean in terms of the bigger picture in her mind. Now, you remember early in the semester, I gave you some material that was outside of the Phyllis Day text regarding the conditions or whatever, the four factors that affected the types of social welfare programs that were implemented in a society. This is going back a long ways, but to the beginning of the semester. But remember, we talked about the level of the output of society impacting the kind of social welfare program that was implemented. That is, if the program was, or rather, if the society was producing a lot of money and a lot of goods, that there would be money for social welfare programs, and that if the society's output was limited or dropping, then funding for social programs would also drop during that era. That was one thing, the level of output of society. Another factor was the view of societal effectiveness, that if we believe that our society was functioning well, then the programs that would be implemented would be programs that really was more geared towards controlling those that were recipients, whereas if we and restricting those, and giving very limited benefits, whereas if we believe that society wasn't functioning well, say for instance during the Great Depression, we would be as a society more prone to implement programs that would assist people. The third factor was, if I remember correctly, the view of human nature, that if we believe basically that human beings were good, then we would implement programs that would encourage individuals to do better, whereas if we believe that basically human beings were bad, we would implement programs that controlled individuals. And the fourth factor was the historical heritage. If you had a history of implementing helping programs in your society, then you'd be more likely to implement them in the society. So the four factors that affected, according to Axon and Levin, the four factors that affected social welfare programming in society or the level of output of society, the view of societal effectiveness, the historical heritage of society, and the view of human nature. Phyllis Day, what she's saying here really isn't that much different, and this is kind of what she's talking about, is what is it that determines the social welfare policies and practice in a society? And Day's perspective on this really is really kind of similar as you think about those four factors, because religion, for instance, has a lot to do with the view of human nature, in economics, politics, those kinds of things. So she believes that the kinds of social welfare policies and practices that we have in our society is a blend of three things, and that is the politics of the society, the economics in our society, and religion. How moral thinking plays into all of this. And so think about that in these terms. This is kind of her view of what impacts the kind of society, kind of programs we'll have in a society. And she says, in the last 40 years, this is really, I think she's thinking back to the Reagan administration, 40 years ago, 76, Reagan, Carter, in that area, that really there has been a synergy, she says, this blending, these three things go together and they create something new. That's a synergy. And she says the synergy has been conservative politics, an economy that was based on the control of oil resources, that was the focus of the economy, and an increasing sense of religious fundamentalism. Much more conservative religion things as well. That this combination of these three factors has led to a steady downward spiral of society's sense of social responsibility in the last 40 years. Since the Nixon administration, and throughout the administrations of Reagan and Bush, Clinton and Bush II, we've seen an increase in privatization of programs. The government has stepped out of social welfare programming, or is trying to do that once again. a decreasing attention on the federal level to poverty. The attempts are to turn these over to faith-based initiatives and private concerns, give it back to the states to control and to manage and to determine limits for. Decreasing attention on the federal level to civil rights. We saw in the last few chapters, some rulings of the Supreme Court that really began to roll back some of the gains that were made during the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s in terms of civil rights movements, and both in terms of the court rulings as well as congressional action. Decreasing federal concerns about income equity. Increasing support of wealthy persons through the Bush tax cuts and the corporate tax reductions, and finally an increasing support of transnational corporations as they move out of the nation and take jobs with them. Transnational corporations really have kind of stepped into the global economy, and our economy has become increasingly globalized for a number of different reasons, and they have really no loyalty to any particular nation any longer, and corporate leaders, in many respects, kind of exercise what Phyllis Day refers to as a shadow government in many nations, and even including the United States itself. The transnational corporations in these third world countries can establish themselves and then threaten to leave the country if the government doesn't produce whether it's tax breaks or decrease regulations or keep regulations at a minimum in terms of things like pollution, and to make sure that the government doesn't implement minimum wage, for instance, standards that would hurt them fiscally. If the governments in these countries did this, transnational corporations could just pull out, and it would really cripple the economy of these nations, and so. In a sense, these leaders of these corporations sometimes run these countries, and there is some a lot of belief about the power elite in our nation that corporate heads really are the ones that pull the strings with our politicians, much more so than the constituents in the politicians' home districts, and so something to be aware of and to keep in mind. George W. Bush, the younger Bush, put presidential power behind the aspirations of those set on moving toward corporate and elitist control of the nation. He supported this. Now, George Bush and Dick Cheney both were men that were heavily invested in the oil industry. The Bush family made its fortune in two areas. One was diplomacy, and the other was oil. And the mixture of these two through three generations of the Bush families, whether it's George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, his father, or I think it was Prescott Bush, which was a senator from Connecticut, that was the senior Bush's father. All of these men were tied up very heavily in the industry, oil industry, and in international diplomacy, and during the 20th century, and so being caught up in the oil industry, it's not surprising to find that during the Bush and Cheney years, and Cheney also very heavily involved with Halliburton and other oil servicing industries, not at all surprising to find that presidential power, encourages the development of corporate control of the nation and elitist control of the nation, and those industries handsomely supported both of the Bushes as they ran for national office for the presidency, and so the Bushes were quite beholden to those industries as well. So while the nation focused on war after September 11th, Phyllis Day says a strong neoconservative coalition oriented towards Christian-centric morality began to take apart the social programs and penalizing those that were seen as unworthy. Containing the poor is expensive, she says, but redefining them as deviants and underclass absolves society of guilt. And this is really a kind of a philosophy or a way of thinking that dates back to the days of the Puritan work ethic, and it's dictate that those who wouldn't work shouldn't be permitted to eat. There was sort of this move backwards in the social Darwinistic thinking during this era. And Phyllis Day says that one of the things that causes change over history is the shifting of power. And she says as groups gain power, they desire more power. And they seek wealth because wealth buys power and luxuries, and somehow religions fall into place to give them moral legitimation. I'm not sure legitimation is a word, but you get the sense at least that this produces values that stick in our societies as truths to which we owe allegiance. And she's really asking us to step back from the political process and to understand what's going on here about what is really, she believes, what is controlling the decisions in our nation, and to recognize the elitist nature of the individuals that are in control. Three of the American values, and she really identifies almost all of them again in this last chapter, but three primary American values that are tied into this include patriarchy, the oppression of women. Patriarchy supports the private ownership of land and therefore the use of outsiders to work it. And so this is part of where our debate over the immigration issue comes in, because while on the one hand politicians talk about protecting our borders, on the other hand, as we've talked about before, we need the illegal immigrants to work the fields and for wages that American workers won't work for and can't work for because of minimum wage legislation, because that keeps the prices of our food down. And so that's a real dilemma set up by patriarchy there. White privilege, and she says, along with patriarchy, white privilege is so pervasive that they're both nearly invisible in Eurocentric societies. We don't recognize that we have this privilege, and racism had become a major pillar of Americans' economy ever since colonial times. And finally, the work ethic, which she says justifies the meanness of the social programs that we have in place in this nation. Other values like social Darwinism, Puritan morality, individualism, those kinds of things aid and abet the effects of those three primary values mentioned earlier. She says, although benevolent values such as democracy, egalitarianism, and charity remain part of the American social ethos, they are very often whispers on the wind, blown away by the primacy of these other values. Even worse, they may be twisted in support of our meanest personal or national goals. Phyllis Day wants us to remember that our values are not necessarily truths, and nor do they need to be facts of our life. These American values, having become aware of them, do not need to rule the kinds of things the decisions that we make and the actions that we take in our society. We should be careful not to accept these values at face value, so that it doesn't interfere in our mission of social value and justice. Social programs usually occurred because they helped to control economic production or civil activism, and we've seen this throughout our history, that sometimes programs were put in place just to quiet people down. However, the presence of social reformers, including social workers, have brought constant altruistic pressure to change social control to socially moral treatment. And so this is one of the places where we have a role as a profession, is to really kind of focus the resources we have on social treatment and to move away from social control. These days, she says, there are new challenges that we need to recognize. That first, under the guise of personal responsibility in our current public welfare system, racism and sexism is legitimized. Next, that work and Puritan morality are values; they're not facts. And these values are used to fuel hatred of those who differ from the norm. Third, the powerful elite make decisions about those without power. Welfare promises aid to the needy, but in exchange for conformity to the oppression. Phyllis Day says, we are now at a moral and professional crossroad with the conservative elite muscling out the poor. It is unconditional love for humanity in all its colors, forms, and features that inspires the best part of social welfare and we must not become blind to that vision. Love is not enough to change the world, but it is surely the best place to begin, and there is still time. So Phyllis Day leaves us with a bit of hope and also some pointing us in a real direction in terms of where we should be placing our attention as professionals in the human services and social work field. And I leave you with those thoughts. I hope that this study of social welfare, and in particular the use of this text, has helped you to understand where we stand these days in terms of how we help the needy in our society, and maybe can provide you with the kinds of support you need as you move forward to take control of this system and try to shape it in a way that will be truly helpful to the clients that we serve. Thanks very much for your attention through this semester, and I hope to see you again in another setting someday soon.